The rain was coming down in thick, angry sheets, the kind of rain that wasn't just falling, but seemed to have a personal vendetta. It hammered against the roof, streamed in rivers down the driveway, and was rapidly turning my brand-new, meticulously manicured lawn into a soupy brown lake. Through the window, I watched the water inch its way up the slope of my yard, a slow-motion invasion that was getting less slow by the second. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the wind. My phone was slick with sweat in my hand. On the other end of the line was Gary, a man whose voice I usually associated with the smell of diesel fumes, damp concrete, and large-scale human misery. "Leo, you have to be 100% certain," Gary's voice crackled, all business. "I can't roll a county rapid response unit for a maybe. Is she actively obstructing?" I watched through the deluge as a figure in a canary-yellow rain slicker, a woman I had come to know with the same morbid fascination a biologist has for a particularly venomous spider, marched away from the community lockbox at the end of the street. I had seen her take it. The one thing that could save us. "It's a definite, Gary," I said, my voice tight. "She has the key. She just seized the community storm drain key." My gaze shifted from her retreating back to the churning water, now lapping at the edge of my porch. "I am 3 minutes from your arrival." I hung up, the finality of it settling in my gut. 3 months. That's all it had been. 3 months since I'd signed the papers on my own little slice of the American dream. 3 months since I'd stood on this very spot, beaming with a stupid, blissful optimism. 3 months since I first laid eyes on the two things that would come to define my existence. My dream house and the instrument of its near destruction, manned by the tyrant of Pleasant Meadows Estates, Brenda. It all started, as most of my professional disasters did, with a misplaced sense of hope. For 10 years, my life had been a series of go-bags, temporary lodgings, and bad coffee in church basements turned command centers. As a consultant for FEMA and a handful of private disaster relief firms, I specialized in water. Specifically, what happens when there's way too much of it in places where people live. I'd waded through the aftermath of hurricanes in the Gulf, coordinated logistics after flash floods in the Midwest, and written enough after-action reports to wallpaper the Pentagon. I'd seen the worst that nature and shoddy infrastructure could cook up. And I was done. So I cashed out, took my savings, and bought a house. Not just any house. The house. A lovely 2-story colonial in a quiet cul-de-sac in a development called Pleasant Meadows Estates. The name alone should have been a red flag, dripping as it was with focus-grouped blandness, but I was too smitten to notice. It had a 2-car garage, a backyard that begged for a top-of-the-line propane grill, and neighbors who seemed to communicate exclusively through polite, distant waves. It was perfect. It was quiet. On that first Saturday, I was living the dream. The air was warm, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the only sound was the cheerful chirp of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. I cracked open a beer, the condensation cold against my palm, and took a celebratory walk around my new kingdom. I was mentally placing the grill, planning a small stone patio, and debating the merits of a hammock between the 2 sturdy oak trees at the back of the property line. And then I saw it. At the lowest geographical point of the entire cul-de-sac, nestled discreetly between the edge of my property and my neighbor Dave's, was a storm drain. It wasn't one of those small, residential things. This was a serious piece of civil engineering, a 3-by-3-foot cast-iron grate, the kind designed to swallow a biblical amount of water. My professional instincts, long suppressed in favor of choosing paint swatches, flickered to life. I felt a familiar twitch in my left eye. I wandered over, my beer forgotten in my hand. A closer look confirmed my burgeoning unease. The grate was almost completely choked. A thick mat of last fall's leaves, twigs, and a winter's worth of street debris had formed a solid, impermeable crust over the openings. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the lock. A thick, heavy-duty padlock, its body helpfully emblazoned with the PME HOA logo, was clamped firmly onto a hasp welded to the grate and its concrete housing. They had locked a storm drain, a primary flood defense system. I stared at it, the sheer, beautiful stupidity of it washing over me. I'd seen some things in my career. I'd seen people build houses on literal sandbars and act surprised when the tide came in. I'd seen town councils argue about zoning permits while a river was actively cresting its banks, but I had never, in all my travels, seen anyone put a padlock on a storm drain. It was like putting a child-proof cap on a fire extinguisher. A memory, unwelcome and vivid, flashed in my mind. The smell of a flooded home in Baton Rouge. Not just water, but the cloying, sickly sweet scent of wet drywall, ruined photo albums, and decay. The smell of everything a family owned turning back into mud. I shook my head, pushing it away. "No," I muttered to myself, taking a swig of beer. "We're not doing this." This was Pleasant Meadows. This was my quiet place. It had to be a simple oversight. The grounds crew probably had a key. A quick, friendly email to the Homeowners Association would sort it right out. It was a problem, yes, but it was a simple, suburban problem. I was so wrong. The doorbell rang the next afternoon. I opened it to find a woman who looked like she was genetically engineered in a lab to be an HOA president. She was in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair that seemed impervious to wind, a pink polo shirt tucked into crisp white capri pants, and a visor that looked more like a command and control interface than simple sun protection. Her smile was wide, bright, and completely devoid of warmth. "Hi there," she chirped, her voice a little too loud. "You must be Leo. I'm Brenda, president of the Pleasant Meadows Estates Homeowners Association. We are just so thrilled to have you." She thrust a wicker basket at me. I took it. It contained a single, lonely-looking blueberry muffin, sweating in plastic wrap, and something much heavier underneath. "Just a little something to welcome you to the neighborhood," she said, her eyes doing a rapid, unnervingly thorough scan of my entryway. I felt like I was failing an inspection. "Thanks. That's very thoughtful," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm still getting settled, but it's a great neighborhood." "Oh, we work very hard to keep it that way," she said, her smile tightening a fraction. "Which reminds me," she pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my garage. "I noticed your trash receptacles are visible from the street. The covenants state they need to be stored inside the garage or behind an approved privacy fence." She paused, letting the information land. "And that garden hose," she added, gesturing at the green coil by my spigot, "is, unfortunately, not one of our approved brands. We have a list of sanctioned vendors for all outdoor equipment to maintain a uniform aesthetic." I blinked. A uniform aesthetic? For garden hoses? "It's the little things that make the big difference," she said, her cheerfulness now feeling like a threat. My internal monologue, which had been enjoying a nice vacation, suddenly clocked in for a triple shift. "I've seen warlords with a more relaxed approach to territorial governance," it muttered. This was my chance. I decided to keep it light, neighborly. "Well, I'll add that to the list," I said with a small laugh. "Speaking of outdoor equipment, I noticed the big storm drain down by my property line seems to be locked up. With the rainy season not too far off, I was thinking it probably needs a good cleaning out." Brenda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. It was like watching the shutters come down on a fortress. "Ah, yes, the common infrastructure," she said, the term dripping with capital letters. "That is kept locked for safety and aesthetic reasons. We can't have children playing near it, and frankly, An open grate is such an eyesore. I get the safety part, I said, trying to keep my tone even. But a clogged drain is a much bigger safety issue. That's the low point for the whole street. If that thing can't swallow water, this whole area becomes a wading pool. Brenda let out a little tittering laugh, as if I'd just told a charmingly naive joke. Oh, you worry too much. The HOA Grounds Committee has it on a seasonal maintenance schedule. We have the only key, and we know exactly when it needs to be tended to. It's all under control. She patted my arm, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt more like a claim of ownership. Now, you make sure to read through that, she said, pointing at the basket. I looked down. Under the sad muffin was a 3-inch white vinyl binder. On its spine, in stark black letters, were the words, Pleasant Meadows, Estates, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. It'll answer any questions you might have, she chirped. Welcome to the neighborhood. She turned and marched back down my driveway, her posture ramrod straight. I stood in the doorway, holding a basket containing one mediocre pastry and a legal document with the heft of a tombstone. The quiet I'd moved here for suddenly felt very, very fragile. This wasn't a simple oversight. This was a policy. And Brenda, the smiling warden of Pleasant Meadows, was its enforcer. That evening, after dutifully putting my trash cans in the garage and coiling my contraband garden hose out of sight, I sat down at my computer. I decided to bypass Brenda's folksy authoritarianism and go through official channels. I found the HOA's email address, a generic board@pleasantmeadows.org, and drafted a masterpiece of professional diplomacy. To board@pleasantmeadows.org. From leo.jenkins@email.com. Subject, inquiry regarding storm drain maintenance, 112 Primrose Lane, Dear Pleasant Meadows, HOA Board. My name is Leo Jenkins, the new resident at 112 Primrose Lane. I wanted to first say thank you for the warm welcome to the neighborhood. I am writing today with a quick question about the primary storm drain located at the corner of Primrose Lane and Tulip Court. In my professional career, I've worked for over a decade as a consultant in water resource management and flood mitigation, so these sorts of things tend to catch my eye. I noticed the drain is currently padlocked and appears to have a significant amount of accumulated debris blocking the grate. Given that this drain services the entire cul-de-sac, which is the lowest point in this section of the development, its proper function is critical for preventing localized flooding during heavy rainfall. I would be more than happy to volunteer my time to clear the debris myself if someone from the board could meet me to unlock it. Thank you for your time and attention to this important matter. Sincerely, Leo Jenkins, 112 Primrose Lane. I hit send, feeling a smug sense of accomplishment. It was perfect, polite, informative, helpful, and subtly flexing my credentials without being obnoxious. No reasonable person could argue with that. The reply came less than 20 minutes later. It was from the same board address, but the tone was unmistakably Brenda's. To leo.jenkins@email.com. From board@pleasantmeadows.org. Subject inquiry regarding storm drain maintenance, 112 Primrose Lane. Dear Mr. Jenkins, thank you for your civic interest. As I explained yesterday, all common infrastructure is managed directly by the HOA board, according to established procedures that have served this community well for over 20 years. The drain is on a seasonal maintenance schedule and is not in need of attention at this time. We do not allow residents to perform maintenance on HOA property due to liability concerns. For future reference, please consult your copy of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, Section 8, Subsection B, Paragraph 4. Resident interaction with common infrastructure. Sincerely, the PME HOA Board. I felt my blood pressure tick up a notch. Civic interest. The condescension was thick enough to stand a spoon in, but I wasn't done. I had data. Bureaucrats, even petty tyrants, sometimes respected data. I spent the next hour on the county and FEMA websites, pulling up topographical surveys and floodplain maps. Just as I suspected. I drafted my reply, attaching a PDF of the official FEMA flood map, on which I had helpfully circled our cul-de-sac. To board@pleasantmeadows.org. From leo.jenkins@email.com. Subject, inquiry regarding storm drain maintenance, 112 Primrose Lane. Dear Board, thank you for the prompt reply. I appreciate the adherence to procedure. However, my concern is based on more than just casual observation. I've attached the official FEMA floodplain map for our area. Map ID hash 42051 C0368. Array. As you can see, our cul-de-sac is designated as being within a 50-year floodplain. A locked and clogged primary drain in such a location constitutes a significant and foreseeable risk to the properties on this street. A seasonal cleaning schedule is insufficient for this type of critical infrastructure. I strongly urge the Board to reconsider its position and allow for the immediate clearing and unlocking of the drain, especially with the spring rainy season approaching. Respectfully, Leo Jenkins. This time the reply was almost instantaneous. It was as if she was sitting there, just waiting for me to challenge her again. To leo.jenkins@email.com. From board@pleasantmeadows.org. Subject, inquiry regarding storm drain maintenance, 112 Primrose Lane. Mr. Jenkins, your unsolicited analyses are not required. The matter is closed. The blunt finality of it was stunning. This wasn't about safety, liability, or procedure anymore. This was about power. I had challenged the Queen in her own castle, and she had slammed the gates shut. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. The quiet, peaceful life I had envisioned was already fading, replaced by the familiar, bitter taste of impending and entirely preventable disaster. A week passed. Every morning, I'd look out my window at the offending grate, sitting there like a tiny, malevolent monument to bad decisions. The politeness strategy had failed spectacularly. The data strategy had been swatted away like a fly. It was time for a new approach, covering my own ass. If the HOA wouldn't listen to a resident expert, maybe they'd listen to a bill. Or, at the very least, a written assessment from a licensed and insured local professional would give me some ammunition for the inevitable next round. I looked up local drainage contractors and found a company with a refreshingly straightforward name: Frank's Drainage and Foundation. No smiling cartoon beavers, no empty promises of water management solutions. Just a name and a phone number. I liked that. The next day, a dusty Ford F-250 that looked like it had personally been through several geological eras rumbled up to my curb. A man who could only be Frank hopped out. He was built like a retired linebacker, with a thick neck, a sun-beaten face, and hands that looked like they could crush coconuts. He wore muddy work boots, jeans, and a t-shirt that said, "If it's wet, I can fix it." "You the fellow with the water problem?" he grunted, shaking my hand. His grip was like a vice. "That's me, Leo," I said. "Thanks for coming out. I'm thinking about putting in some French drains, wanted to get a quote and an assessment of the property's drainage situation." I was careful with my phrasing. I needed his unbiased, professional opinion first. Frank grunted again, a sound that seemed to be his primary mode of communication, and started walking the perimeter of my house. He kicked at the soil, squinted at the downspouts, and peered at the foundation with an expert eye. I followed him like a nervous student. He finished his loop at the side of the yard, stopping a few feet from the locked storm drain. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. Then he looked at my house, then back at the drain. He scuffed the grass with his boot, noting the gentle but unmistakable slope of the entire cul-de-sac towards that one spot. Well, he finally said, turning to me, I can install all the French drains you want, son. I'll charge you a fair price for it, too. But I gotta be honest with you. He jabbed a thick thumb towards the grate. It won't make a lick of difference if that thing's clogged. When a big rain comes, a real gully washer, this whole street's gonna be a bathtub, and your house is sitting right where the drain should be. A wave of pure, unadulterated validation washed over me. That's what I thought, I said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. The HOA keeps it locked. Frank let out a short, bark-like laugh that startled a nearby bird. Of course they do, he said, shaking his head. You got one of those HOAs, huh? The kind run by some busybody with a god complex who thinks a petunia bed is more important than hydrostatic pressure. You've met Brenda? I asked dryly. I've met 100 Brendas, he grunted. They're a menace. They think a rule book can stop 200,000 gallons of water. Good luck, son. You're gonna need it. Could you, put that in writing for me? I asked. Your professional assessment, I mean, about the primary flood risk being the community drain. Frank's eyes twinkled with what I recognized as the spirit of joyful defiance. He knew exactly what I was doing. For a small administrative fee, I can write you a report so detailed it'll make your eyes water, he said. I'll use lots of big words like critical failure point and gross negligence and imminent threat to property. The Brendas of the world hate that stuff. 2 days later, a formal, signed letter from Frank's Drainage and Foundation arrived in my inbox. It was a thing of beauty, a masterwork of blunt, practical prose that laid out the entire situation in terrifyingly clear terms. I now had a documented, third-party professional opinion from a man who wrestled with mud for a living. I saved it to a folder on my desktop I had grimly labeled the Brenda Dossier. The arsenal was growing. Now I just needed a place to deploy it. The monthly HOA meeting was next Tuesday. The Pleasant Meadows Estates monthly HOA meeting was held in Brenda's garage. The space was so clean and organized it felt less like a garage and more like a surgical theater for lawnmowers. Pegboards held gleaming tools arranged by size and function. The concrete floor was painted with a glossy gray epoxy that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. We, the residents, sat on folding chairs arranged in neat rows, facing a long table where Brenda and 2 other ancient-looking board members sat like a tribunal. The air was thick with the scent of lemon pledge and quiet desperation. I came prepared. I had 10 copies of a 1-page summary, complete with Frank the contractor's dire assessment, the FEMA flood map, and my own polite, bullet-pointed recommendations. I was ready for a rational discussion among concerned homeowners. What I got was a descent into the 9th circle of suburban absurdity. The meeting began, as all such meetings do, with a tedious reading of last month's minutes. This was followed by the treasurer's report, delivered by a man who looked like he might crumble into dust if a strong breeze came through. Then came the main event, the agenda. Item 1, the Flamingo Motion. A resident on the next street over, the Masons, had apparently installed a single plastic pink flamingo in their flower bed. This was the subject of a 20-minute debate. It's kitsch, one woman declared, clutching her pearls. It lowers property values, another man insisted. Brenda listened with grave solemnity. The covenants are clear, she intoned. Section 12, subsection D. All lawn ornamentation must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Which, of course, was also just Brenda. Motion to issue a formal citation and a $50 fine to the Mason family? The motion passed. 12-1. The one dissenter was a teenager who was only there because his mom made him come. Item 2. The beige transgression. A 40-minute argument about the approved shade of beige for mailbox posts. Apparently someone had used desert sand when the approved color was clearly Tuscan wheat. Heads shook, tongues clucked. I felt my soul slowly leaking out of my ears. Finally, my turn came. New business. Mr. Jenkins has an item regarding the storm drain. I stood up, cleared my throat, and handed out my summary sheets. Hi, everyone. As some of you know, I have a professional background in flood mitigation. I have a serious concern about the storm drain at the end of our street. I kept it brief and to the point. I explained the floodplain designation. I read the most damning lines from Frank's report. I showed them the map. My recommendation, I concluded, is simple. The HOA should immediately unlock the drain, contract a service to have it professionally cleaned, and implement a monthly inspection schedule, especially during the rainy season. It's a simple, preventative measure to protect all of our homes. I sat down, feeling I'd made a clear, logical, and irrefutable case. Brenda let the silence hang in the air for a moment. She picked up my summary sheet, holding it by the corner as if it were a soiled tissue. She didn't look at it. She looked at me. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "for that dramatic presentation." A few people chuckled nervously. "Are we to allow one new resident," she began, her voice rising, "a man who has lived here for less than a month, to come in here and tell us that 20 years of proven procedure is wrong?" She scanned the room, making eye contact with her flock. "He wants ugly, open grates everywhere. He talks about floods and disasters. This is Pleasant Meadows, not some third-world country. We are a community of standards." She was a master. In 60 seconds, she had reframed the entire issue. It wasn't about safety versus negligence anymore. It was about us versus him, the established community versus the alarmist outsider. "He wants to spend our hard-earned HOA dues on contracted services and monthly inspections for a problem that doesn't exist," she continued, her voice filled with theatrical outrage. "I, for one, would rather spend that money on our annual community picnic and planting new azaleas along the entryway." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the garage. Azaleas. She was fighting a potential natural disaster with flowers. And she was winning. "What's next?" she scoffed, throwing my paper onto the table. "Barbed wire? Sandbags? Do we need to militarize our beautiful neighborhood because one man has an obsession?" I tried to interject. "This isn't an obsession. It's a documented structural risk." "The floor is not yours, Mr. Jenkins," she snapped, her smile gone, revealing the granite underneath. "I believe we've heard enough. Is there a motion to dismiss this concern?" A hand shot up. "So moved." "Second?" "Second." "All in favor of maintaining our current proven procedures for common infrastructure maintenance?" Every hand but mine went up. Even the teenager, startled into action, raised his. My neighbor Dave, who had taken a copy of my handout with a worried expression, looked at me, then at Brenda, and slowly, reluctantly, raised his hand. His eyes were apologetic, but his allegiance was clear. "The motion carries," Brenda declared, a triumphant smirk gracing her lips. She banged a small gavel on the table. "Meeting adjourned." I sat there for a moment in my folding chair, the useless summary sheets scattered on the floor around me. I had come with facts, with data, with expertise. I had been defeated by beige mailboxes, imaginary flamingos, and the promise of azaleas. The war was just beginning. Reason had failed. Democracy, at least the garage-based version of it, had failed. My strategic options were narrowing. So I fell back on the one thing that never fails in a fight against a bureaucracy: the bureaucracy itself. It was time to build a paper trail so thick, so meticulously documented, that it could be used as a blunt instrument. I shifted into what I privately called post-disaster CYA mode. cover your ass. It was a skill I had perfected over years of dealing with insurance adjusters, government auditors, and lawyers looking for someone to blame. The first step was a certified letter. Email could be deleted or ignored. A certified letter, with its little green receipt, was a legal handshake. It was proof they had received it. The letter I composed was a dry, joyless recitation of the facts. It detailed my initial contact, the subsequent email exchange, the professional assessment from Frank's Drainage and Foundation, a copy of which I included, and the discussion at the HOA meeting. I formally stated, for the record, that the HOA board had been made aware of a significant and foreseeable flood risk and had, by vote, chosen to do nothing. I outlined the potential for property damage and noted that their decision could be interpreted as gross negligence, opening the HOA, and by extension its board members personally, to significant liability. I sent one copy to the HOA's official address, Brenda's house, and another to the treasurer, just for good measure. The little green return receipts came back a few days later. I stapled them to my copies of the letter and filed them away in the Brenda dossier. It wasn't a solution, but it was a shield. Meanwhile, the world outside Pleasant Meadows was moving on. The weather reports, which I had started monitoring with a low-grade hum of anxiety, began to get more interesting. A tropical depression had formed in the Gulf of Mexico. The TV meteorologists, in their crisp suits, pointed at a swirling comma of clouds on the satellite map. It was thousands of miles away, a mere curiosity. But it was organized, and it was heading north. My professional paranoia, never far from the surface, kicked into a higher gear. I made a phone call. "County Office of Emergency Management, this is Gary." His voice was a familiar, gravelly rumble, the sound of too many cigarettes and too many 3 a.m. emergency calls. "Hey, Gary, it's Leo," I said. "Got a weird one for you." A heavy sigh on the other end. "Leo Jenkins, don't tell me. You finally took that retirement, moved somewhere quiet, and immediately found a disaster waiting to happen." "You know me too well," I said. "You guys have any jurisdiction over HOA-maintained storm drains?" I could almost hear him rolling his eyes. "Oh, God, don't tell me. You moved into one of those neighborhoods. Let me guess. The president thinks she's a feudal lord and the bylaws are the Magna Carta?" "You have no idea," I said, a grim smile on my face. "She's more of a Napoleon, but with better hair. Listen, I'm not asking for anything yet. I'm just giving you a heads up. Building a file. Might get spicy down the road." "Spicy how?" he asked, a new note of interest in his voice. "Let's just say there's a critical piece of flood mitigation infrastructure being deliberately kept non-operational by a civilian with a power complex." There was a pause, and then a low chuckle. "Leo, you have a gift, you really do. All right, I'll open a preliminary file. Pleasant Meadows Estates. Send me what you've got. And for God's sake, try not to get yourself arrested." "No promises," I said, and hung up. A few days later, the swirling comma on the weather map had a name. They were calling it Tropical Storm Hannah, and the projected cone of uncertainty, that big, ominous funnel showing its potential path, was pointing directly at our coastline. The rainy season was about to begin with a bang. The certified letters had, predictably, elicited no response. But they had clearly struck a nerve. Brenda's strategy shifted from dismissive condescension to active aggression. I found this out on a bright Thursday afternoon. The forecast for Hannah was getting uglier, and I was getting twitchier. For my records, I decided to take a time-stamped photo of the still-clogged, still-locked drain. I walked down to the end of my driveway, knelt, and framed the shot on my phone, making sure to capture the thick mat of debris and the gleam of the HOA padlock. As I stood up, I noticed a curtain twitch in Brenda's front window across the street. I thought nothing of it. I was, after all, a resident standing on my own property, near a public street. I went back inside, uploaded the photo to my dossier, and started making a pot of coffee. 10 minutes later, I was startled by the sight of a police cruiser rolling slowly, silently, down our quiet cul-de-sac. It came to a stop directly in front of my house. My first thought was that there had been an accident. Then, 2 officers got out, their expressions a perfect blend of boredom and annoyance. They walked up my driveway. I opened the door before they could knock. "Afternoon, officers. Something I can help you with?" The taller of the 2, whose name tag read Miller, spoke first. "Sir, we received a call about a suspicious individual casing the neighborhood infrastructure." He said the words "suspicious individual" and "casing" with a distinct lack of conviction. My brain took a second to process this. She had actually done it. She had called the cops on me. "You're kidding me," I said, a laugh escaping before I could stop it. "We don't kid, sir," the other officer, Johnson, said, his tone flat. The caller reported a man taking photographs of drains. He looked from me to the storm drain and back, a flicker of comprehension in his eyes. "Let me guess," I said, rubbing my temples. "The call came from that house over there?" I pointed to Brenda's beige fortress. Officer Miller sighed, a long, weary sound. "Sir, we just need to confirm who you are. Do you live here?" I produced my driver's license, which of course had my new address on it. "Leo Jenkins. I live right here. I was taking a picture of that drain because our HOA president refuses to clean it, and it's a massive flood risk. I'm documenting it." Just then, Brenda's front door opened. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, a caricature of a concerned citizen. "Officers!" she called out, her voice ringing with false alarm. "Is everything all right? That man has been harassing me for weeks. He's obsessed with that drain." Officer Johnson turned his head and muttered something to Miller that sounded suspiciously like, "Dispatch said this was a 1039. This is a 10 Karen." Miller shot him a look, then turned back to me. He handed back my license. "All right, Mr. Jenkins. Your story checks out. We're clear here." He then raised his voice to address Brenda. "Ma'am, he's a resident. He's allowed to be on his own property." "But he was photographing HOA property," she insisted, taking a few steps onto her lawn. "It's intimidating." "It's a drain, ma'am," Johnson said, his patience visibly fraying. "It's a civil matter. If you have an issue with your neighbor, you'll have to take it up with the HOA." The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. The officers tipped their hats to me, a gesture that felt like an apology. "Have a good day, sir," Miller said with a look that clearly communicated, "Please don't let us have to come back here." They got in their car and drove away. I stood in my doorway, watching Brenda retreat back into her house, her back rigid with indignation. The line had been crossed. This was no longer just a dispute. It was a war of attrition, and my opponent had just tried to use the local police as her personal goon squad. The storm on the horizon was no longer just a weather pattern. It felt like a reckoning. The governor's press conference was grim. Tropical Storm Hannah was now Hurricane Hannah, a Category 1 storm churning in the Gulf, and it had our stretch of the coast dead in its sights. A mandatory state of emergency had been declared. Schools were closing. The local news channel had switched to 24/7 coverage, with reporters in rain slickers standing in front of swaying palm trees. The air itself felt heavy, charged with anticipation. The official declaration of emergency was the legal trigger I'd been waiting for. It changed the game from a civil disagreement to a public safety issue. That evening, a nervous-looking face appeared over the top of the fence that separated my yard from my neighbor's. It was Dave. He was holding a pair of hedge clippers, though he clearly wasn't doing any trimming. "Hey, Leo," he started, his voice low. "I saw the cops here yesterday, and I've been watching the news." He gestured vaguely towards the sky. You really think that drain is going to be a problem?" It was the first crack in the wall of neighborhood apathy. Fear, it turned out, was a more powerful motivator than pie charts. "Dave, I don't think it's a problem. I know it's a problem," I said, walking over to the fence. I didn't bother with the data this time. I went for the gut. When that storm hits, all the rain that lands on this pavement, on these roofs, on these lawns, it's all going to run to the lowest point. That's right here. The drain is the only way out. If it's blocked, the water has nowhere to go but up. It'll fill this street like a swimming pool. Your garage is lower than your house, right?" He paled, the reality of it finally sinking in. "Yeah, my wife's new SUV is in there." "Exactly," I said. "This isn't about property values or azaleas anymore." He looked from my face to the locked grate, then back. The fear in his eyes had solidified into a grudging resolve. "What do we do?" "I'm sending one last email," I said. "An official, final warning. It would help if it came from more than just me. Do you want to co-sign it?" He hesitated for only a second. Yeah, okay. My wife would kill me if that car gets flooded." I went inside and drafted the final volley. It was short, sharp, and stripped of all pleasantries. I cited the governor's emergency declaration and the specific state statutes that granted authorities broad powers during such events. I CC'd Dave and sent it directly to Brenda and the rest of the board. To board@pleasantmeadows.org. CC dave.miller@email.com. Subject: urgent. Final warning regarding imminent flood risk. Board members, in light of the governor's official declaration of a state of emergency for our county and the imminent arrival of Hurricane Hannah, we are making a final, formal request for the storm drain at the corner of Primrose Lane and Tulip Court to be immediately unlocked and cleared of all obstructions. Your continued refusal to address this documented critical safety issue constitutes gross negligence and actively endangers the lives and property of residents. Under State Statute 252, all citizens are required to comply with emergency orders and not interfere with disaster mitigation efforts. If the drain is not rendered fully operational by the time the storm makes landfall, we will be forced to utilize outside resources to mitigate the threat and ensure the safety of our community. Please be advised that any and all damages resulting from your inaction will be the full liability of the HOA and its board. No further warnings will be issued. Sincerely, Leo Jenkins. 112 Primrose Lane. David Miller, 114 Primrose Lane. I hit send. The ball was in her court. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the leaves on the oak trees. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly shade of gray. The final countdown had begun. The day of the storm arrived not with a bang, but with a sinister whisper. The morning was unnaturally still and quiet, the sky a blanket of metallic gray. By noon, the first bands of rain began to sweep through, fat, heavy drops that splattered against the windows. By 3 p.m., the whisper had become a roar. The wind howled with a deep, guttural moan, shaking the house in its frame. Rain was no longer just falling. It was being driven sideways in horizontal sheets, reducing visibility to near zero. I had done all I could. I'd brought in the patio furniture, laid sandbags at the base of the garage door and the front door, and checked my emergency kit. Now all I could do was watch, and the thing I was watching was the water. It started as a large puddle in the street, right over the useless drain. Within an hour, the puddle had consumed the curbs. An hour after that, it was a vast, churning sheet of brown water that had swallowed the sidewalk and was now creeping, inch by terrifying inch, up the gentle slope of my front lawn. The street signs were submerged halfway. A neighbor's recycling bin sailed past like a little blue boat on a furious river. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I hit Gary's number on my speed dial. This call was different. The folksy humor was gone. This was professional protocol. "Gary, situation update," I said, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. I was in my element now, the muscle memory of a dozen disasters kicking in. "Go ahead, Leo." His voice was calm and clear on the other end. "We have sustained rainfall. I'd estimate 2 inches per hour, maybe more in the gusts. The primary storm drain from my sector is non-operational. It is artificially obstructed, padlock confirmed." I peered through the rain-streaked window. The water was now touching the roots of the big oak tree. "I estimate another 90 minutes, maybe less, before we have significant property inundation, starting with my house and my neighbors." "Is the obstructionist still refusing access?" Gary asked. "Affirmative," I said, a grim satisfaction in the formal language. "The feudal lord is holding fast. I haven't seen her, but the lock is still on." "All right, Leo," Gary said, his voice hardening with purpose. "Listen carefully. My rapid response team and a sheriff's escort are staged at the fire station a mile from you. We're ready to roll. But the law is tricky on this. I need you to confirm that she is actively preventing access during the emergency. It can't just be that the drain is locked. She has to make a move, show intent to keep it locked in the face of the storm. The second you have that confirmation, you give me the green light. Not a minute before. It has to be airtight, or I'll be the one getting sued." "Understood," I said. "I'll be your eyes on the ground. Standing by." I hung up and stood by the window, a sentinel watching the slow, inexorable rise of the floodwaters. The quiet, peaceful cul-de-sac was gone, replaced by a churning cauldron. Every gust of wind, every sheet of rain was another tick of the clock. All I could do was wait for Brenda to make her final, fatal mistake. My vigil at the window was tense. Every shadow, every piece of debris swept along by the current made me jump. The water had now completely submerged the bottom third of my lawn and was licking at the concrete edge of my front porch. It was no longer a question of if my house would flood, but when. My sandbags looked pitifully small against the growing lake. Then I saw her. A figure in a bright yellow rain slicker emerged from Brenda's front door, head bent against the driving wind. She wasn't heading for the drain. She was marching with grim purpose towards the bank of community mailboxes at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Next to the mailboxes was a small, unassuming metal box mounted on a post. The HOA emergency lockbox. The place where spare keys for community assets were supposed to be kept. My blood ran cold. I knew what was in there. Brenda fumbled with a key, opened the lockbox, and reached inside. She pulled out a single, large, brass key attached to a heavy-duty chain. The master key for the storm drain. The key that could save us. I didn't even think. I grabbed my rain jacket, yanked it on, and burst out my front door into the tempest. The wind hit me like a physical blow, and the cold rain instantly soaked my jeans. "Brenda!" I roared, my voice barely carrying over the storm. "What are you doing?" I slogged through the ankle-deep water covering my driveway and into the street, where the current was stronger. She was halfway back to her house when she heard me. She turned, her face a mask of grim satisfaction, the rain plastering her helmet of hair to her head. She held up the key, letting it glint in the stormy twilight. "Brenda, for God's sake, you have to open the drain. Look at this." I gestured wildly at the water, which was now swirling around my knees. A wild, triumphant look ignited in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had been challenged and was now delivering the final, crushing blow. "This is HOA property," she shrieked over the wind. "I will determine when it's an emergency, not you." And then she did it. With a final, contemptuous glare, she shoved the key deep into the pocket of her slicker, turned her back on me, and began her slow, deliberate march back to the safety of her dry house. That was it. That was the moment. She hadn't just failed to open it. She hadn't just neglected it. She had, in the middle of a declared state of emergency with floodwaters actively rising, taken positive action to seize the only means of rescue. It was no longer incompetence. It was a willful, malicious act. It was airtight. I stood there for a second, knee-deep in the churning, debris-filled water, the sheer audacity of her action stunning me into silence. The wind ripped at my jacket, and the rain felt like tiny, cold needles on my face. Then, the paralysis broke, and a cold, clear purpose settled over me. I turned my back on her, sloshed back to the relative shelter of my porch, and pulled out my phone. The screen was slick with rain, and my fingers were stiff with cold, but my hands were steady. I hit 1 on my speed dial. Gary answered on the first ring. "Talk to me, Leo." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. This was a field report. "Gary," I said, my voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "It's go time." "You're positive?" 100%. Subject has physically seized the key from the community lockbox. I have visual confirmation. She is in possession of the means of mitigation and is refusing to deploy. I have a direct quote from her stating she will be the one to determine if it's an emergency. I took a deep breath. "You are clear to proceed. I am 3 minutes from your arrival." I hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. The next few moments stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the howling of the wind and the gurgle of water flowing where it shouldn't. I watched the water creep up the first step of my porch. It was happening. It was really happening. And then I heard it. It started as a sound that didn't belong in the storm's chaotic symphony. Not the distant wail of a siren, but a deep, guttural, ground-shaking whoop, whoop that vibrated in my chest. It grew louder, closer, joined by the roar of a powerful diesel engine. A pair of impossibly bright headlights cut through the gray deluge, and then the vehicle itself rounded the corner into our tiny, flooded cul-de-sac. It was a massive, brilliant white, heavy-duty truck from the County Office of Emergency Management. It looked like an ambulance on steroids, with storage compartments lining its sides and a bank of floodlights on its roof that suddenly blazed to life, turning our stormy twilight into harsh, artificial daylight. Its giant tires churned through the water, creating a wake like a boat. Behind it, lights flashing but siren off, was a familiar sheriff's department patrol car. The cavalry had arrived, and they had brought a monster truck. The OEM truck came to a halt in the middle of the street lake, its engine a low, powerful rumble. The driver's side door opened, and a figure in a heavy-duty black and yellow OEM jacket hopped down into the thigh-deep water. It was Gary. He strode towards me, his face grim and all business, looking completely unfazed by the hurricane raging around him. 2 technicians, also in official gear, hopped out the other side, one of them carrying a set of bolt cutters so large they looked like a prop from a superhero movie. At the same time, the patrol car pulled up. Officers Miller and Johnson got out, their faces a perfect picture of thunderstruck disbelief. They waded over, their expressions clearly saying, "It's a drain. How did it come to this?" "Leo!" Gary barked as he reached my porch. "Where is she?" I didn't need to say a word. I just pointed a single, trembling finger at Brenda's front door. Gary nodded curtly. "All right, let's go have a chat." The 4 of us, Gary in the lead, me right behind him, and the 2 bemused officers flanking us, waded through the current towards Brenda's house. The water was shockingly cold. We marched up her pristine walkway, now a flowing river, and mounted her porch steps. Gary banged a heavy fist on the door. "County Emergency Management," he yelled. The door flew open. Brenda stood there, ready to unleash a tirade, but the words died in her throat. She stared at the sight before her. Me, her dripping wet nemesis, 2 grim-faced sheriff's deputies, and a man in an official OEM jacket who radiated an aura of absolute authority. Behind them, the massive emergency truck sat idling in her flooded street, its lights bathing her house in an apocalyptic glow. What is the meaning of this?" she stammered, her voice a pale shadow of its usual commanding tone. "This is private property." Gary didn't even blink. He held up his phone, which was in a waterproof case, displaying a PDF. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but carrying the full weight of the government. "This is a declared disaster area. Under State Statute 252.36, during a state of emergency, I have the authority to commandeer, use, or control any private property, real or personal, necessary for the preservation of life and public welfare. You, ma'am, are currently and actively obstructing a critical piece of flood mitigation infrastructure." He paused, letting the legalese sink in. "Your neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, is a credentialed expert who has documented this risk for weeks. We have a file. You have been formally warned multiple times, and my witness," he jerked his head towards me, "just saw you physically remove the key that would solve this problem, so you have 2 options." He held up one finger. "Option 1. You give me the key right now, and we open that drain." He held up a second finger. "Option 2. I have my deputies here charge you with a Class 1 misdemeanor for reckless endangerment and willfully obstructing an emergency management operation. And then my team will simply cut the lock off anyway. Your choice. You have 5 seconds." Brenda's face went through a rapid series of emotions: outrage, disbelief, fear, and finally the dawning, horrific realization that her little kingdom of rules and regulations had just been invaded by a much, much bigger kingdom. She looked at Officer Miller, who just gave her a pointed, weary look. She looked at the giant bolt cutters. Defeated, her shoulders slumped. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her yellow slicker, her hand trembling, and pulled out the big brass key. She practically threw it at Gary. He caught it deftly. "Thank you for your cooperation." He turned to one of his technicians. "Get it done." The technician sprinted, splashing through the water to the drain. We all watched. He knelt, inserted the key, and turned. There was a loud clunk as the padlock sprang open. He yanked it off, grabbed the grate with both hands, and heaved it open. The effect was instantaneous and glorious. There was a deep sucking sound, a hungry glug-glug whoosh, as a vortex of muddy water, leaves, and a stray flamingo lawn ornament from the next street over began to swirl and pour into the thirsty earth. The sound was deafening, the sound of a problem being solved with dramatic, undeniable force. Within minutes, the water level in the street had visibly dropped by several inches. Gary turned back to Brenda, who was staring in mute horror. "We'll be sending the HOA the bill for our response time," he said, not unkindly. "Have a safe evening, ma'am." He turned and strode back towards his truck, a conquering hero leaving a vanquished foe on her porch. I gave a final, small nod to Officers Miller and Johnson. Johnson, I swear, gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. Then I turned and waded back to my own house, the water around my legs already receding. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, scrubbed blue. The neighborhood, however, was a wreck. Tree branches littered the lawns, overturned trash cans lay in the streets, and a fine layer of silty mud coated everything. But my house and Dave's house were miraculously, beautifully dry. The lawn was a swamp, but the porch, the garage, the foundation, all were untouched. The drain had done its job. A few houses further down the cul-de-sac, where the water had pooled the longest before the drain was opened, weren't so lucky. Their garages had taken on a few inches of water, and Brenda's prize-winning petunias, which lined her walkway, were gone, washed away into the county sewer system. It was a small, poetic justice. At the shockingly early hour of 9 a.m., Dave appeared at my front door. He wasn't holding hedge clippers this time. He was holding a 6-pack of beer. "You," he said, his voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for astronauts and Super Bowl quarterbacks, "are an absolute legend." He thrust the beer at me. "My wife's SUV is dry. She wants to bake you a pie." The story of Brenda's primetime standoff with the Office of Emergency Management had already spread through the neighborhood with the speed of a wildfire. People who had previously averted their eyes when I walked by were now giving me thumbs-ups from their driveways. I was no longer the alarmist outsider. I was the guy who had brought in a tactical unit to fight a puddle. Brenda, meanwhile, was a pariah. She hadn't emerged from her house. A shiny black sedan from a downtown law firm was parked in her driveway for most of the afternoon, a clear sign that the two families with the flooded garages were not taking it lying down. Her reign was over. The social fabric of Pleasant Meadows had been ripped, and when we stitched it back together, she would not be at the center. I sat on my front steps, popping open one of Dave's beers. The air was fresh and clean. The world was quiet again. This time it felt real. It felt earned. 6 months later, Pleasant Meadows was a different place. An emergency HOA meeting had been called the week after the storm. It was held not in Brenda's garage, but in the community center, and the turnout was 100%. Brenda was not present. She was unceremoniously and unanimously voted off the board and out of office. In a fit of revolutionary fervor, they tried to nominate me for president. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. I politely but firmly declined, explaining that my only platform would be the immediate and total dissolution of the HOA. That sobered them up. Instead, I did something constructive. I used my professional experience to help the new, shell-shocked board find and hire a legitimate, third-party property management company to handle the neighborhood's affairs. The rules were still there, but they were now enforced by a detached, dispassionate professional who didn't care about the color of your garden hose, only that you paid your dues on time. The storm drain was now a sacred object. The management company had it inspected and cleaned every month. The padlock was gone, replaced by a simple, easy-open latch that a child could operate. Brenda and her husband sold their house at a loss and moved 2 towns over. I heard it was a community with no HOA. I hoped, for their sake, it was on high ground. And me? I was finally living the life I'd dreamed of. That fall, I built my stone patio. I bought the best propane grill money could buy. I spent my weekends perfecting my burger grilling technique and drinking beer with Dave. Just before Christmas, I got a card in the mail. It was a simple, cheap card from the local pharmacy. Inside, there was no signature and no message. It was just a small, yellow plastic rubber duck, the kind you win at a carnival. I knew immediately who it was from. I laughed, a deep, genuine laugh of pure satisfaction. I took the little duck and placed it on the shelf above my grill. A tiny, silent trophy from my one and only battle in the great suburban wars. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was home.